So good evening, everyone. It's a great pleasure to be back in Glenties. Everyone knows that I love Donegal and I love coming to the MacGill Summer School. And can I begin by getting the serious business of the evening over, and that is, I'm very relieved as a Kerry woman in Donegal today. Firstly, you didn't beat us. And that's really important, because those of you who know what we suffer in the pursuit of All Irelands tells you that if you're from Kerry, football it's a disease. But equally, as a good guest, Kerry didn't beat Donegal either. So I feel very comfortable that it was an honourable draw, and I wish both our counties well in the search. The real target this year is to make sure that the boys in blue do not get 5 in a row. And I know there's lots of dubs out there. Anyway, I want to thank Joe for the invitation. I always read Joe's paragraph and I think, what of the questions tonight will I decide to answer? So I picked out this: is the European Union under threat as never before? I have a short answer: no, it's not under threat as never before. I think we need to go back to basics and to remember what the EU is. It is a distinctive political order. It has 2 pillars. It is a union of states, its member states, and it is also a union of peoples. And it was an extremely radical objective at the end of the 1940s, the beginning of the 1950s, that in this part of the world, after a long European civil war, 2 world wars, that there was a decision to create something new. And we can argue about what it is, its problems and its challenges, but it was deeply radical. And we fail sometimes to recognise just how radical that was. And can I begin, because I've had a bugbear for the last couple of hours, and that is that I have great respect for someone who says, I dislike the European project as a political project, I don't want my country part of that. That's a perfectly respectable political stance. But the categorisation and classification of the EU by Eurosceptics should be as open to scrutiny as the classification and categorisation of the political order by anyone else. So today I heard that the problem with the EU was something called giantism. Now, I don't think the word exists, but if we look at giant, a giant is an imaginary, mythical figure, supersized. So, giantism and the EU. So yes, the EU consists of 28, soon to be 27 member states. It is continental in size. It is very big. But should that be a cause for concern, that this system went from 6 to 9 to now 27, 28 countries? No. It's a mark of success, because the EU could have, as a club of 6, decided we're West European, we are comfortable, and we are rich. And had the EU of 6 decided to do that, poor Ireland, 55% per capita incomes of the centre, would not be a member state today. So the EU has been open to poor states, to problematic states, and it hasn't said the borders are closed. So if giantism is that the EU is open, then I think that's a good thing. Secondly, we heard today that the EU has a problem of technocracy. Well, what does technocracy mean? Technocracy means the application of expertise to complex problems. And the EU does deal with a lot of complex problems: air quality, water quality, medicine standards. Now, I would prefer that experts were dealing with air quality, water quality, and medicine, and the standards, safety standards in the cars I drive. So if expertise is a problem in the EU, I welcome it, because without expertise we would have pretty poor laws and have a problem. But the EU is not run by experts. The EU is run by politicians. The senior office holders of the member states in the European Council, the most legitimate political office holders in Europe, sit in the European Council. They're constantly going over and back to Brussels. I'm always astounded that they decide to meet in the evening. They should change and meet in the morning, but that's neither here nor there. That's the practice. Also, the European Parliament is the only transnational directly elected parliament in the world. Should we think that's a problem? Well, I, for one, do not. And then this idea that somehow or other we're being run by unaccountable elites. Well, if someone stands before the people and the electorate and is elected, these are accountable elites. They are elites. All societies have them and have them through history. And in the world we live in today, we have much more accountable elites than at times when it was the arbitrary power of monarchs or the church. So I have to say that yes, the EU should be interrogated, but it must be interrogated with a degree of accuracy and knowledge of historical context that it deserves, because it is part of the world we live in. So what are my key messages this evening? I have two. One, that we live in a time of profound change. We live in what Max Weber would call a switching time in history, much bigger and much deeper and much more structural than the EU itself. So we live in a time, we don't live in a time of equilibrium, we live in a time of shift and shock and change, and it's profound and it is structural. And I don't think we're going back to any stable equilibrium in the world we live in anytime soon. And secondly, we face a problem in the world today of the demand and supply of governance. If we sat round tables this evening here, we could all come up with a pretty consensus list of the problems that needed to be addressed. We could agree on what they were. The problem is not the demand for governance in the world we live in. The problem is how to supply it. We know what the problems are. They stare us in the face day in, day out. But it is extremely difficult to supply governance in the world we live in today at local, national, European, global, continental level. In terms of the EU, and I was thinking of this in terms of the longevity of MacGill, 39 years, the EU we have today is profoundly different to the EU 39 years ago. And there's been two major pillars of change. The first is the 1980s to 2008. That was the single market, which was transformative, integration through law and regulation, the structural funds that helped build roads in this country, as we know, enlargement, all of that treaty change, this constant, we all experienced it, you know, we could rattle them off, Maastricht, Amsterdam, Nice, Lisbon, etc., etc. And that has meant, and of course the euro. And that has meant the salience of the EU in all of our lives went from pretty low to much more significant. So that's one whole set of change. The other set of change, and we've heard it tonight, is that the decade of crisis that we've had. And it really has been crisis. The Great Recession, and of course the euro crisis was existential, and of course it was serious. But also this young and new currency had its first crisis at the greatest crisis in global capitalism since the Great Depression. So it was pretty difficult timing. We've had the refugee crisis, and now we've had the geopolitical shocks. The Arab Spring in the early part of this decade looked as if that there would be democracy on the southern shores of the Mediterranean, and we've seen that burn into instability, failed states and trauma for millions and millions and millions of people. We also have Crimea. Suddenly, for the first time in post-war Europe, a European state literally took over a part of another country, Crimea, regardless of whether one views it as Russian historically or not. And then finally, we had 2016 with Brexit and Trump. But I think all of this has to be seen against the really big changes. We are facing 4 big transformations technological, ecological, geopolitical, and social. And they're all interconnected, and they're all structural. On the whole technology, and I'm very glad I am the age I am, that most of it I'll be gone by the time it comes into play. I went to the Web Summit in Lisbon a couple of years ago, and I walked up and down these tents looking at the world to come, and I thought, woo, out of here. But there's a whole bundle of issues here. Data is the new goal. Who owns it? Who monetizes it? Who controls it? Who has it? A lot of regulatory issues, public-private issues there. AI and the nature of work. Algorithms. Even now Facebook creating a new money, the Libra. I mean, central bankers must be terrified of the world to come. So there's a whole bundle of issues that are around technology. Ecological transformation. We talked a lot today in earlier sessions about growth. But do we think this planet can survive unless we change our growth model? Do we think? Now, again, it's for our young. But again, the nature of cities, how people live, all of that. And then the other two, I talked of the geopolitical transformation, and I will come back to it. And then there's the social transformation. We live in much more disaggregated societies. When I grew up in Carsaveen, County Kerry, on a Friday evening, everyone watched The Virginian. And it was a very simple society. The society I now live in, and my children will live in, is very, very different. The connections, the interconnections, the fragmentation. I think also the intergenerational. I think young people, their attitudes, social mores, their attitudes towards cars, driving, how they live, all of that is very different. And one of the, in terms of behaviour today, and particularly political behaviour, the killer variable is education. If someone tells you what level of education they have, it is as good a predictor of a lot of stuff than most other things. So again, these are big shifts. And I'm not a sociologist, and I'm a political scientist. I look at power, I look at institutions, I look at how decisions are made, but I know all this stuff matters. In terms of what all of this is doing to democratic politics and to the EU is in a period of politicisation and contestation, and it should be. How could we imagine that the EU could go from 6 countries to what it is now, from being in charge of customs and tariffs to now having a currency without being contested? Also, Euroscepticism, as we have heard, opposition to the project itself is increased. But I don't think it's, in terms of its ability to bring the project down, I don't see it. I didn't see it in the European elections, and I don't see it now. And also there's been counter-mobilisation. I think one of the most interesting factors about the United Kingdom is the emergence of a strong pro-European sentiment. I see more European flags now in London than I've ever seen in my entire life in any other part of Europe. The UK will leave the EU, but what I'm saying is there is now a counter-mobilisation. And finally, democratic politics is changing. The infrastructure of politics is changing. Political parties are no longer what they once were. Political communication is being transformed. We now know that we receive knowledge about politics on our smartphones or Twitter or all the other things we use, and we also know that they can be abused. And political behaviour has become less predictable and more volatile. So what does all that mean? It means, firstly, can the centre hold? Well, I think we've got to think of the centre as stretching. The centre, because our societies are changing and more fragmented, then the political marketplace is more fragmented and the continuum will be longer. It's not good for any political system if it becomes extremely polarised, because polarised politics tends not to find consensus, tends not to find a place, not consensus, maybe accommodation is a better word. In our societies, there's a new cleavage as well. It's not the traditional left-right cleavage that came to dominate post-war politics in Europe. There's now identity cleavages, cultural cleavages around immigration, openness, closure, borders that are really important. We have, as has been alluded to, an authoritarian turn in a number of countries, Hungary, Poland, the Czech Republic, and many others. We shouldn't be surprised because the eastern half of the continent was not deeply democratic in its prehistory of EU membership. And it went from a totalitarian system to very rapid change in terms of its economic order and politics. So I think what we have to ask is the space still in East Central Europe for the authoritarians to be turned? And there's only one country that I really worry about, and that's Hungary. I think Orban commands all of the levers of the Hungarian state, and all the bright Hungarians have left. And any society, they kicked out the Central European University. Any modern country in a world of a knowledge economy and knowledge society that gets rid of a world-class university is in civilizational difficulty. So the one country, Poland, I think there are real issues, but the one country that would worry me more than any is Hungary. And then there is also the rise of the Greens. So it's not all to the right. Lucinda talked of left-wing populism again, but there's also the Greens. So I think that there's a lot more going on in politics, and the political marketplace is very. There's a lot of churn at the moment in politics. So again, the shifts and shocks in the EU itself. Internally, I'd make a number of observations. The EU has been hardened through crisis. The EU is no longer the normative, naive power that the world would be a wonderful place if only the world was like us. I'm afraid when you look through the barrel of the gun and see your currency go down, and remember that had the interbank markets froze twice during the Eurozone crisis, and had the euro gone down, it was a global financial collapse, and it would have damaged everyone. So the EU is a much tougher, harder, resilient institution now, 10 years later, and it's not afraid of acknowledging and using power. The 27 have displayed through the immediate reaction to Brexit, and it was immediate, it happened within 5 days, firstly on the 24th of June and then the week after at the European Council. There is an absolute determination to protect the gains of integration, and that's not going to change. And they will, I think, over the next 5 years, get on top of the rule of law crisis, and they must. And they've got to start making it very expensive for those countries in terms of structural funding if they don't observe the rule of law and the independence of their judiciary. And then the question for Europe is what kind of political economy in the next phase? Because Europe, in terms of, particularly in technology, is not, the technological developments are being driven elsewhere. So then externally, will the EU, and this is a big question for the EU, will it be squeezed by the growing competition between the United States and China? And I read a very interesting paper by a former student of mine, Henry Farrell, former student of UCD. He's a professor in DCU. He's a professor in DC in Washington at the moment. And he talked of, in this paper, weaponized interdependence. And it was a paper tracing the use the United States, the Trump US, is making of power. And he basically argues that Trump is turning interdependence into a weapon. And someone else has written an equally interesting paper looking at the Chinese and saying the Chinese are also engaging in weaponized interdependence. And the question for Europe is, if the world is going to be a classical back to power politics and less multilateralism, how does Europe how does Europe cope? Russia. We have, as a near neighbour, a country that is led by someone who thinks that we have arrived at the demise of liberalism. Putin is very happy to be interviewed by the Financial Times to say the liberal order is over. Now, I'm always struck when it comes to Putin is why he doesn't put some of his energy in making Russia into a country where people live longer, have better quality of life and better housing, etc., etc. But he doesn't. Putin's Russia has links to the radical right. I see it unfolding daily in the Italian press with the Lega, Salvini. And the special ops that the Russian state engages with goes right back to the tradition of the special ops the KGB used forever. So we have got to accept that Putin's Russia, Putin as now, not the first Putin, but Putin as now, is a danger to the rest of Europe. And of course, he's buying off individual countries. And then there's the neighbourhood. It's a tough neighbourhood. Europe finds itself, and again, I'm very conscious living in Italy, of how exposed the Mediterranean is on the northern shores of the Mediterranean to the instability on the south. And we're very far away from it here in Ireland. But in Italy, they face it, they confront it, and we shouldn't be surprised that Italy is struggling politically at the moment. It's had a pretty stagnant economy for a long time, and it also has had to deal with the brunt of the migration movements and mobility. So in terms of Europe's response, the big issue, and this is where the strategic strategy comes in, can Europe be strategic at home and abroad? Can it find the strategy gene? And that's really difficult when you involve lots of countries with very different preferences. The one area where Europe is being really strategic at the moment is trade. It is being, as it saw the multilateral trading system in trouble, Europe has gone to hoover up as many bilateral or multilateral deals, regional deals, I should say. So Europe can be strategic and has been particularly strategic on Brexit, but it needs to be strategic about an awful lot else. So that's a big question. The Council, the European Council, had, I have it there on the floor, a strategic agenda for the next 5 years. It's right. What they want to do is what they should be thinking about. The question is, can they do it? And then we're left with a 5-year new institutional cycle with all of the new politicians. So I'm going to end very quickly with some graphs. So firstly, what we have to accept is political Europe is joining legal Europe. That political space is opening up in Europe, and whenever political space opens up, things will get turbulent, things won't be particularly neat. But on this diagram, and this is very recent, in terms of people, whether they think their country has benefited from EU membership, it's over 60%. And it's really only, it's very low in one country, and that's the country I now live in, that's Italy. It is even, believe it or not, I think in the United Kingdom over 50%. But anyway, what I'm saying is that political Europe is there. These are the reasons why people voted in the European elections. Because of citizenship, because their vote would matter, because they want to change the EU. Citizens in Europe increasingly see Europe, and not just the national, as an important political space. And this one is, what are the issues? The blue is the economy, the green is ecology. And so that's, in my view, the big political economy battle for the next 5 to 10 years, is how we handle ecological change within the economic constraints. And I will end with this. So it's not going to be pretty. There's going to be a lot of conflict, a lot of struggle. But we have a choice in this part of the world, and that is, do we allow Putin and Trump and Orban and Boris Johnson to dictate our future, or those 3 wonderful women on the bottom? Thank you.